This video is going to take you through 5 steps you can use when approaching a debating topic. So this video is going to be really helpful if you're new to debating or if you need a bit of a reminder of the steps that you can take as you work towards preparing your debate for your competition night. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be using the topic for the DAV Schools Competition Round 1 2018 for D grade. And that topic is that the Olympics should expand to include non-sporting events. So our first step in this 5-step process is to define the topic. Basically, when we're defining the topic, we're asking ourselves, what is the debate about? So we're looking at the topic and considering what that topic is actually asking us to explore. It's not a case of just turning to our dictionaries and looking up the meanings of keywords, but it's about examining what those terms mean in the context of the debate at hand, and maybe actually deciding what we think those terms mean in the context of the debate at hand. So it's a brainstorming process rather than a research process. So if we look at our topic that the Olympics should expand to include non-sporting events, the first thing that we'll need to do is identify terms that need to be clarified. The first will be the Olympics. We might need to clarify what we mean by expand, and we'll also need to consider what we mean by non-sporting events. So here's one way that we could define the topic. This is not the only way that we could define the topic. That's up to you and your team, but here's one way we could do that. First of all, the Olympics. Well, we could think about that and think that in our debate, we would like to talk about both the Winter and Summer Olympics and both the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Now remember, if you are the affirmative team, you'll need to present your definition. If you're the negative team, you still need to think about your definition so that you'll know whether you accept the definition that the affirmative team presents, but you'll also need to think about it. How is the affirmative team likely to interpret this? What is the logical interpretation of this? To define the word expand, we're probably going to understand that to add to the existing roster of sporting activities. So the word expand there is important because it's not asking us to replace any existing sporting events. Now, non-sporting events is really where this becomes an interesting kind of definitional debate, because especially if we're the affirmative team, we can decide what that term means because it could be interpreted many different ways. One way that you could interpret it is, okay, non-sporting events, we might think about activities that have a skill or strategy component that can be judged. So including competitive non-sporting activities such as debating or chess, but also non-competitive non-sporting activities such as visual art and music. So it's up to you and your team. You might say, well, non-sporting events, we're just going to define that as competitive non-sporting activities, or you can include both definitions there as well. You might also say non-competitive non-sporting activities. Again, when you're trying to define a topic, you should be looking for what is the logical, reasonable definition of this, or what is a reasonable definition that we can make here. The reason we need to be really careful with these definitions and thinking about reasonable definitions is because if we try and get a little bit crafty and think about ways that we could define the topic that isn't reasonable and logical, then we can get ourselves into trouble. So, for instance, if we look at this topic, one way that you theoretically could define this topic is to define Olympics as the house Olympic events that schools run. But that's not really a reasonable interpretation of this topic. If it's an obscure definition that you're trying to make, then it's going to be unreasonable and is probably going to be challenged by the opposing side of your debate, and the adjudicator is going to side with the team that presents a more reasonable definition. This brings us on to the second step of our 5-step process, brainstorming arguments. Now, my hot tip for brainstorming arguments is that you need to do the thinking yourself. So you'll notice that this step isn't about research, it's about brainstorming. So it's about sitting with your team and thinking about some arguments that can support your side of the debate. One thing that you can use to help you as you begin this brainstorming process is the DAV website's Schools Competition Resource Guide. So you can access this page just by Googling DAV Schools Competition Resource Guides, and you'll find that each topic for each round has with it a resource guide that will assist you in guiding your brainstorming process. So if I click on the D grade round 1 page, this is the PDF that's available to me there. The thing I really like about these resource guides is that they give you some questions to consider. And these questions to consider are going to help you to formulate your arguments. So let's return to our topic that the Olympics should expand to include non-sporting events. So I'm going to imagine that I am the affirmative team for this debate. One argument I could brainstorm to support this proposition is that if we included non-sporting events in the Olympics, we would allow more diverse talents and skills to be celebrated. Another argument could be that this will help to modernise the Games. Including non-sporting events in the Olympics may encourage more diverse viewership of the Games. It may encourage people to watch the Olympics who currently don't watch the Olympics. It might help to mitigate the damaging effects of performance-enhancing drugs on the Games. So we know that that's rife throughout sporting events, but will including non-sporting events mean that that's not so much of an issue because maybe people won't be able to take performance-enhancing drugs for those events? Would this change allow a greater number of disabled athletes to compete without having to split the Games into Olympic and Paralympic? Or would it allow access for disabled athletes who currently can't compete in the Paralympics? And would this allow disadvantaged countries that have limited access to high-tech sporting and training facilities to be more competitive in the Olympics? So these are all some possible arguments I can think of to support the proposition that the Olympics should expand to include non-sporting events. So now that I've brainstormed arguments, we come to step 3, which is to divide these arguments and prioritize them. So when we say prioritize them, we mean think about which of our arguments are our strongest ones. So one way that we could sort these arguments, divide them, is to include these 3 arguments as one group and these 3 arguments as the other. You might have figured out that the categories I'm thinking about here, the division I've made, the way I've sorted these arguments is in terms of arguments that are about benefits to competitors and arguments that are about benefits to spectators and organisers. So in this instance, I've chosen to divide my arguments into 2 groups by stakeholders. So that's people with a particular interest in this proposition, people who have something to do with this proposition or who will be affected by it. I could also divide my arguments according to theme. So for instance, I could divide my arguments between social implications and economic implications. That would be a thematic division. It's up to you, but once you have your arguments, once you've brainstormed them, you need to divide them into 2 or 3 groups. 2 groups is a really nice way to divide them because, of course, our arguments are going to be shared between our first and second speaker. Remember, of course, that our third speaker doesn't get any arguments because they shouldn't be presenting new material. After we have divided our arguments into 2 groups, we then need to decide which of those groups presents a stronger case. Because if we remember, we always give our strongest arguments to our first speaker and our less strong arguments to our second speaker. So in this instance, I would say that our arguments about our benefits to competitors are probably going to go to our first speaker. I think they're probably our strongest ones. And our second strongest ones are about benefits to spectators and organisers. So we'll probably give those arguments to our second speaker. So now we have defined the topic, we have figured out what our arguments are going to be, and we've also figured out what our team split is going to be. Now we come to step 4, which is about research. So research is probably pretty self-evident. You are going to be using your research to give you a little bit more of an understanding of the arguments that you have brainstormed that you would like to present to support your side of the debate. So here are some tips for research. If you remember from that resource page, there are some links that the DAV suggests that you start with. I would absolutely start with those resources because the DAV has spent time handpicking you those resources. Basically, when you're researching, the thing that you want to come up with is not other people's words or phrases about the arguments that you're putting forward, but you're looking for examples because each argument that you present should have a really strong evidence-based argument to support it. Something that you should also keep in mind as you come to the research process is what you are likely to have to rebut. Because if you can also research evidence that is going to support any rebuttals you might be likely to make, that's going to strengthen your position going into the debate as well. So it might be good when you get to this stage of research to also spend a little bit of time brainstorming what your opposition is likely to argue so that as you enter this research phase, you can also research some evidence that you can use to support your rebuttals. Because remember that your rebuttals and the strength of your rebuttals also makes up part of your mark for matter, as well as your own arguments and evidence. Finally, that brings us to step 5, which is, of course, to write your speech. So now you have your definition, you have your arguments, you have your team split, and you have some fantastic researched evidence to support the arguments that you present. You also have some research that's going to assist you in providing evidence with the rebuttals that you make against the opposing team. At this point, you might want to access the speaker roles video that will help you that will give you a guide as to what you should include in your speech. So whether you're first speaker, second speaker, or third speaker. It's really important as you're writing your speech to remember to signpost. And if you're not sure what signposting is, I suggest you look on the debating handbook or you access the St Leonard's College debating page for more information about signposting and how you can use it as you write your speech so that you can best showcase the fabulous matter that you have just come up with. Good luck.